Hello and welcome to this interview episode of the Primary Maths Podcast, the show where we talk all things primary maths with me, John Cripwell. In today's episode, we are thinking about something really important in maths teaching, as ever, but particularly we're thinking about how we design lessons and tasks that really get children thinking rather than just completing work. My guests today are Kate Henshall and Kat Martin from Rethink Maths, and between them, they've worked as primary teachers, maths leaders, and senior leaders in some pretty big organisations that you might recognise. Now they're helping to lead some really exciting work focused on, amongst other things, foundations in maths. So in this conversation, we explore questions such as, what do we actually mean when we talk about foundational knowledge in maths? Why slowing down can sometimes be the most powerful things that we can do, and how teachers can move beyond just getting the answer towards deeper mathematical thinking. We also talk about representations, manipulatives, questioning, and how small shifts in task design can make a big difference in the way pupils experience maths in the classroom. So if you're interested in helping pupils notice more, think more deeply, and engage more meaningfully with mathematics, I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. Before we jump in, just a quick favour. If you enjoy the podcast, please do follow or subscribe on wherever you're listening, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, etc., because it really does help more teachers to discover the show. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share articles, ideas, and reflections about primary maths teaching, or subscribe to our Substack. You'll find the link in the show notes here, where I write longer pieces about curriculum, lesson design, and mathematical thinking. And if you'd ever like to suggest a topic or a guest for the podcast, you can always get in touch with us. The email is primarymathspodcast@twinkle.co.uk. Right then, let's get into the conversation. My guests today are Kate Henshall and Kat Martin, and I am delighted to have them on the show. Welcome both.
Hi, nice to be with you today, John.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat about maths. So can we just take a moment just to introduce yourselves to the listeners, to anybody who's not familiar with the work that you do? Kate, would you mind going first? Just a brief introduction, just say how you've come to be where you are now.
Yep, so I'm the Education Director at Rethink Maths. I've been there coming up to about 6 months now. Prior to that, I was the Deputy Director of Education at White Rose Education. And, really responsible for kind of the maths programs and the products that we created, particularly with early years and primary. And then prior to that, I was primary school teacher, teaching across the primary age range. Actually struggled with maths initially in my PGCE year, and then just kind of really made it my passion and my focus, and that kind of led me down the path of becoming a maths leader in school, joining the Maths Hub network, and then becoming a mastery specialist. And that's really where kind of my love and enthusiasm sparked for maths, and then led me to where I am today, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. So a wealth of experience. And Kat, how about yourself?
Thanks. So my experience is really similar to Kate, actually. So again, been with Rethink Maths. I'm Director of Foundations. Been with them for about 6 months. And before that, I was Head of International Development at White Rose Education. Really supporting work within developing countries, getting those foundational numeracy strategies and support in those places. And before that, I was coming from a primary school teacher background and a senior leader, working through across a variety of ages. And it, again, similar to Kate, it was during my teacher training, I found the love of maths and started doing my maths and then my masters. And then that brought me into the Maths Hubs, which kind of led me on to finding the work with White Rose Education. So, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, the Mast was a brilliant program, wasn't it? I really enjoyed it when I was on it, and it's a shame I don't think it's around anymore. It's a real shame. So again, thank you so much, Kat. A wealth of experience and things, particularly thinking around task design and things that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Kate, you sort of mentioned that maths wasn't really your thing on the PGCE. What was it like for you at school? Can you remember maths at not that it was that long ago, Kate, that's not what I'm insinuating, but what was maths in terms of, was maths a memorable subject for you at primary school?
I think I enjoyed maths, and I did really well actually. Right up until GCSE, and I actually wanted to study at A level. But I think I kind of struggled to get that really deep conceptual understanding. I was very kind of good at revising, very good at like rote memory and learning procedures. Um, so I think that kind of like masked my understanding of being really good at maths actually. And
Yeah.
then at primary school, I suppose my really one standout memory is being in year 3, and we were doing then 100 tens and units and having the deans or the base 10 equipment, and I just loved it. I really understood what I was doing. I really loved using the equipment. They were purple, the ones that I
Yeah.
was using. And I think that so then when I then became a primary maths specialist and working at Whitewell's Education and seeing the powers of manipulatives and representations, it kind of like brought me back to that really like concrete memory in year 3. So yeah, that's probably the one memory that stands out for me in terms of maths at primary school, definitely.
Yeah, I remember those purple base 10 or Dean's cubes and things as well. Unfortunately for me, I don't remember really understanding them particularly, which
No.
just made everything a little bit more tricky for me, I think, unfortunately. Whether that was the way it was presented or just something I missed, I don't know. But they remained a mystery until I started teaching with them, really, I think. How about yourself, Kat? What was maths like for yourself?
Had quite negative experiences with maths actually at school. So it was a subject that I didn't like, didn't enjoy, felt like I couldn't do it. I have memories of like, particularly in secondary school, my teachers saying in front of everybody, "Oh, you've got a weird brain, like don't know how you've done
Wow.
this." I can remember sitting on the bus with my friend and like asking, like showing her like my workings out, and me like, "Is this right? Like, can you check?" And then I learned like the triangular formulas in chemistry, and then decided like that I could try and apply those to maths and would get her to check them, and just memorized everything. So it was never something that I thought that would turn into a career and a love of mine. Definitely, if you'd have asked me at that age. But I was lucky. I got a very inspiring teacher in my teacher training, and she actually showed us the base 10, the deans, and she showed us the addition and exchanging. And I just had this like, wow
Yeah.
moment. I was like, oh, that's what it means. This is it. And she kind of sent me down this rabbit hole then of trying to find out like, well, if you can teach it that way, like how else can you teach it like for that understanding, and how can you make sure that like nobody feels that way that I did in those classrooms?
Yeah. A great non-example, I think, of how to build a classroom culture of inclusivity and making children feel safe from the first teacher that you mentioned there. But I had a very similar experience with my PGCE tutor for maths, which is a guy called Dave Benson, who just made maths make sense for the first time ever. And I remember thinking, I wish I'd been taught like this sort of 20 years before, because it would have made a huge difference to me, I think. So yeah, thank you very much. It's always interesting to hear the stories that people bring and the backgrounds that they bring to things. One of the and I apologise because I've not prepped you for this question, so don't feel obliged to go into any depth on it. But you mentioned foundation knowledge there briefly, Kat, possibly in a different context to the way that it's being talked about a lot. But I've been in a couple of meetings over the last couple of days, and obviously we've heard the term foundational knowledge referred to a lot recently, and I know Rethink are doing things around foundational knowledge and things. I just thought it would be helpful for the listeners, really, if we could maybe clarify what do we think we're talking about in maths, particularly when we're thinking about foundational knowledge that children need in order to access the rest of the curriculum.
I think that's a great question. It's such a big question as well. And like you say, I've been hearing the word foundations a lot. And I think it depends on the context that people are talking about it in. So when people talk about foundational numeracy, generally, I think maybe prior to like the last year or so, that foundational numeracy was always like the starting blocks, like the very first foundations when you're talking some like thinking about like the foundation stage, and having those very first blocks of learning so that then you can build on those. What I think is happening more increasingly is people are acknowledging the way that maths is so connected. And, I wonder sometimes whether this is maybe because of the pandemic and, where children have had different gaps that they previously would have had because they missed different parts of their learning. So I think there's more of an acknowledgement of the foundations of different different topics within the subject. And that actually for you to be able to progress through something, you need to have the foundations. And so, it's that horizon knowledge, isn't it? Thinking about like where something has come from, where it's going to go to, and where you are right now, and how that's connected. And if you haven't got that knowledge before, actually, that's really hard. And you need to have those foundations to be able to build upon them. So if you're like a year 6 teacher and you're looking at, for example, fractions or decimals in different ways, actually the foundational knowledge that you need for that is very specific to that topic that you're teaching. I do think it's an interesting one. And I'm hearing people, like you say, use the word foundations in the two different contexts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a really helpful explanation. Kate, I don't know if you remember years ago when Teaching for Mastery sort of came in, this term mastery was being sort of bandied about, and children mastering things, and teaching for mastery, and mastery pedagogy, and maths mastery, and there was a lot of confusion, I think, around, and it took quite a few years, I think, for teachers to really understand how the term was being used in terms of a pedagogical sense. And I'm a little bit cautious that we might end up doing the same thing with foundations in maths and what that means. I don't know if you remember what that was like, Kate, when that sort of mastery term first sort of came on into the mainstream.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even now, even 10 years on, or more than 10 years on, there's still interpretations of what that means, isn't there? And how that looks in a classroom context. Is it about teaching all of the children together, or is it about really recognizing where the children are in their learning and thinking, okay, so they've mastered this skill, what's next for them? And I think there's lots of nuances to it. And I think it's really important to think about making sure that we've got that shared understanding of what you might mean for Teaching for Mastery in your context. What does it mean from a Maths Hub perspective? Because that's a very clear message and very clearly defined. But I think as long as you understand what you mean by that term and how it looks in your context and your setting, and you can confidently articulate it, that's what's important. And I think that's going to be the same for foundational learning, particularly when schools are expected to explain that to anyone externally coming in.
Yeah.
What do we mean by this term, and what is our interpretation of it?
Yeah, that was kind of the context that I've heard it over the last couple of days, meeting with some head teachers and things who've recently had Ofsted visits and things like that, and that, they were being asked about foundational knowledge, and just wanted some clarity really over what the right. It's funny, isn't it? What the right answer is supposed to be, I'm not sure. Maybe we can help people with that a little bit. And I think the answers that you've given have certainly done that. But even going back to just the mastery thing, I remember, mastery being almost an assessment level, that yes, they have mastered this and they're working at mastery level and things. I just think that really wasn't what we were talking about. I remember an analogy being that when you were learning to drive a car, you're thinking about everything that you're doing as you begin to have those first lessons, and where the clutch is and where the accelerator is and where the brake is, and you don't want to get those things wrong. How which indicator, which lever's the indicator and things. And then after you've been driving a while, you can get to your destination and having not really thought about it at all. And at that point, maybe you've considered that you've mastered the art of driving a car in a day-to-day sort of setting without having at any point become a professional racing driver or anything. It's not about that kind of level of becoming a master of to that sort of level. I still hear it sort of talked about in those contexts a little bit sometimes. So it's interesting where this language goes that's associated with education, I think. But what I wanted to talk to you about today really was the idea of how we can encourage children or provide opportunities, as many opportunities as possible really, for children to engage with mathematical thinking, to move beyond just trying to put the right answer in the right box on a worksheet, and think a little bit more deeply about the things that they're talking about. And task design, I think, is definitely a part of that. And so I suppose, as a starting point, what do you think about when you're thinking about a lesson or a series of lessons, or even just a task within a lesson? when you're thinking about what the children are going to be thinking rather than what they're going to be doing. Is that a starting point for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously it relies on assessment, doesn't it? You need to really know your children and kind of where they are as that starting point. But then equally based on that, where are you going? So, you might be using a scheme, you might be using pre-designed resources, which are great. They really support that teacher workload. But I think it's then really kind of engaging with them, isn't it? And thinking, right, what is this learning? What is the learning going to look like? What will the children be thinking deeply about? And I think with that, really thinking, what is it that I want children to notice? What is it that they're going to attend to? And how are they going to unpick that mathematics? So I think initially it would be that for me. I don't know if Kat's going to add more.
Yeah, I'd say starting with their purpose, isn't it? What is it that you want the children to learn in that point? Like, what is it that you want them to notice? And then thinking about how best to work with that with your children, knowing your children and where they were up to in their learning, what's come before it, and where you're trying to get them to go to. And I think
Yeah,
sorry.
I agree. I think that takes a certain level of subject knowledge, though, doesn't it, to be able to do successfully, because you can have a learning objective. So, for instance, I was working with a teacher earlier this week, and we were looking at this teacher is working in a very, very small school, which obviously isn't necessarily a typical context for everybody listening, but um, this teacher is teaching Key Stage 2, essentially, to 11 children from year 3 to year 6. And so I was trying to support in ways to think, how can we um, make this manageable whilst also, being as effective for the pupils as possible. So we started looking at one of the year 4 objectives, I think it was, which was around subtraction. And, the learning objective was, can I subtract one 2-digit number from another? And you think, well, that's what I want them to know, isn't it? But actually, I think what you're talking about there, both of you, is possibly a bit more detailed than that, isn't it? Not just, can I subtract one 2-digit number from another 2-digit number?
Yeah, there's the
Yeah.
procedures, isn't there? And then there's the understanding behind it and being able to apply it, being able to explain about it, like being able to see those patterns. Is that difference between like, when I said about me and my experiences at school, like, I was doing those column subtractions and additions for it, but it wasn't until like in my teacher training, you see base 10 and you have that understanding, I wasn't able to apply. I wouldn't have been able to apply. That's why I needed my friend to check everything. It goes much deeper than just being able to go through those procedures. But it is, like you say, it's a lot of subject knowledge that's required, which is why there's so many more resources available now than ever were. I can remember when I first started planning my lessons, trying to do teaching for mastery, and there was nothing, there was hardly
No.
anything, and it used to take me hours to try and do things. But I think now that there is a risk where there is materials, but we have to still. One of our colleagues talks about like intellectual preparation. Like you have to still take that time to go through the materials and think like, what's the purpose? What is it that you want the children to learn at this point? And then how are you, and that will be different to every class. Like, how are you in your class with your children going to make that applicable for them?
Kate, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, and it just kind of sparked a little bit of a memory. This was a few years ago now, but I think it's relevant to the discussion. I was in a year 4 class, and they were looking at short division, so the bus stop method, for want for a better, term.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they were referring to as actually. And they were using place value counters to kind of model that algorithm. And the place value counters were, you'd expect them to be, hundreds, tens, and ones, but they were just a mixture of all place value counters. So some of these place value counters went up to like 1,000,000, some had fractions on, some had decimals on. And I remember speaking to the teacher afterwards and said, can you explain why you were using, the manipulatives? And they said, oh, because it's just what we had access to. I just wanted them, to make the groups and then do the exchanging. And they kind of almost missed missed the point. Like they recognised that was helping the children do the procedure, but it really wasn't helping the children, have that conceptual understanding or that deep thinking, and they weren't relating it to place value at all. And this was a few years ago now. I think probably in the early stages of kind of teaching for mastery and the Maths Hub network, but it's scarred in my brain a little bit in terms of what not to do, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tricky though, isn't it? To how do you get to going back to the lesson I was thinking about, or the learning objective? What you could have broken that down much more deeply, as you say, into conceptual understanding. But even thinking about within that, is it close to is the subtrahend close to a multiple of 10? Is that going to help me? Am I going to use a mental method to do this, or am I going to use a written method? All those sorts of things. Am I going to am I going to compensate or redistribute, or there's so many different things that you could do with it. Sometimes it can be difficult to know what it is to do, and that's where I think the schemes can help, isn't it? Because generally they do break it down into into those steps a little bit more. But if you don't have the subject knowledge, or maybe the pedagogical knowledge to go alongside it, that's where it can be a bit tricky, or you might miss the point, as you say, Kate. I think that happens perhaps a little more often than we would like to, with why when you. And it's a great question to ask. Sometimes you get teachers, won't you, as a maths lead and things saying, do I have to do it this way that it says in the scheme? Because again, probably year 4 is my traumatic experience with short division as well, Kate, actually. And regular listeners will probably have heard me talk about this before, but there was a sequence of lessons in the year 4 scheme of work that we used that were particularly tricky. Because it was all about trying to break down the number that you were going to divide, and trying to find multiples of the divisor within that number, and looking for different ways of doing things mentally, really. And inevitably, the teacher would come to me as a maths lead and say, can't just show them the bus stop method, because if I show them the bus stop method, they'll get it, they'll get the answer, and that's and I always thought at the time, well, that shows me what we're valuing here is, can I follow a procedure and get the answer? That's the most important thing in the lesson. Whereas I think it's a mindset shift to think, actually, maybe the answer isn't the most important thing, maybe the understanding is more important, and yes, this is difficult now, and we should look at ways that we can try and make it more accessible, definitely. But it's quite tempting to skip over some of the tricky stuff in order to get an easier answer, isn't it? I think that's possibly storing up problems for the longer term, though. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think, your example there, maybe for that person, the method that they were exploring, or the way that they were exploring it first, was trickier because they've not experienced that as a learner. And, maybe their experience at school was stop short division. And I think what we've got to acknowledge is that for some children, that bit that you've just described there, that might be that aha moment, that might be the light bulb moment where they start to connect, some previous learning to the new learning. And I think that's what we've got to constantly think about, is how can we have those light bulb moments, or how can we have that conceptual understanding really come into the forefront, because they can see the underlying structure, they can see what's going on, that bit makes sense when they then come to do maybe something more complex like a formal algorithm.
Absolutely. Kat, anything you'd like to add?
No, I was just thinking then, I was thinking the exact same as Kate was on it, and I was thinking about, I think there's some questions Jo Bowler's looked at before, where she gives you a question and it asks like what strategy that you're using to answer it. And, I think that's things like that are really interesting, because, a lot of us have got a set method that we use, and like, that's what we're comfortable with. That's in our comfort zone. And so we want to use that one, and actually, but that's different for everybody, and how, we'll approach that same question might change. But if we only ever show children one way, then it's not always the most efficient. Just because it's the way that we see it doesn't mean it's the way that's going to make the connection for them. But it is really hard, as you say, like, amongst the three of us, we've had negative experiences ourselves at school with maths. So, I've got to think about like the majority of teachers as well. It's not always the most popular subject to teach. And there's a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, no, I agree. And also I think sometimes you can, I don't want to get too much into the politics of this, but sometimes the accountability measures and things in school, we focus a lot, don't we, on pupil progress and summative assessments and things, and can we see the progress through some of those test scores and things like that, and therefore that does make us lean towards valuing getting an answer and getting an answer quickly, and even when you think of the year 6 tests, there's a whole 40 marks available for the arithmetic paper and things, which again values efficient methods to quickly get an answer. And so it does feel as if we are being pushed a little bit as a profession towards, can we, by some of these accountability measures, can we help children to get an answer very quickly and efficiently and accurately? Which I agree is important, by the way. Maths is sometimes about getting an answer quickly and efficiently and accurately. But on the flip side of that, the sort of pedagogy says that actually we should be taking things a little bit slower and making deeper connections and encouraging children to think about things. So there's a bit of a tension there, isn't there, between how we are kind of judged a little bit as teachers and actually what we are expected to do in terms of best practice.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think just having that confidence to go a little bit slower and make that time for deeper, for depth, rather than kind of trying to rush through. In my experience, often, has gains. Like children start to make connections. They start to, those anxieties start to reduce because you're valuing that time to explore. And math, maths you should be exploring. You should be noticing things. You should be making those connections. And if it's always about, skill and drill or valuing, speed over depth, children are never going to explore or develop those kind of mathematical behaviours that will enable them to explore things in more detail.
Yeah,
No, I totally agree. Sorry, Kat, go on.
I was just saying, getting that depth for the foundations, like that, like what we talked about before. If you're thinking about it in terms of like the connections between things, you having the time to explore, you get those foundations ready, which then you reap those rewards when you start to build on it.
Yeah, that makes
and
sense.
I think a conversation, Kat might not remember, but a conversation I was having with Kat recently is, say if you just take a 6 add 7, for example, as a teacher, how are you going to explore that? Are you going to explore counting on? Are you going to explore making 10? So you do, 6 add 4 add 3. Are you going to explore it as a near double? So 6 plus 6 plus 1. There's so much that you could do with just that one fact. And there's so many different strategies you could use to solve it. And then deciding, well, which strategy will I explore so that it then becomes automatic for my children. It's a bit of a minefield for some teachers, isn't it? Because how do they know which to prioritise? But is it about actually, looking at that one fact and exploring the different strategies you could use, and then letting children, decide which strategy works for them? For me, I like double 6 plus 1, but for somebody else, they might like partitioning it and making 10. So, I think, yes, it's about teachers having subject knowledge, but also that confidence to explore less in more detail so that then children can really, internalise it and understand it in a way that's, going to commit to their memory.
And for me, the explicit teaching of those different strategies is one of the best things that's happened in the last probably 10, 11 years. In terms of the changes in how we teach maths, because again, just going back to, not that I was in primary school 10 or 11 years ago, sadly, but going back to my primary school experience, I might have been given some cubes to do that with, and it would have been very much counting on. Perhaps we might have done it with base 10, possibly, to see that we can make a 10 and then 3 more, as you say. But I think a lot of children who went on to feel very confident in maths implicitly picked up some of those skills of trying different methods and different strategies and noticing how you can manipulate number. And then pupils like myself who didn't feel very confident about it kind of got stuck with a counting on method or something that wasn't particularly efficient, and everything felt quite difficult in order to be successful. So yes, I totally agree. Therefore, how do we? What are the skills maybe that the teacher needs, or the strategies that a teacher should be thinking about, perhaps, when we've got the lesson plan almost? I don't want to say the lesson plan, but the scheme has given us an example of what the lesson might look like. There might be a PowerPoint that goes with it as well, with some models and pictures and things on, and some example questions. And given how busy teachers are, there's quite a pull maybe for some teachers to think, okay, well, that's largely sorted for me. That lesson, I can pretty much pick that up and go with it, and I'll spend my time planning French instead. What should teachers be thinking about at that point instead, do you think, if we want to engage children in mathematical thinking and really engage them in the lessons? Do they need to approach it in a different way?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on it a little bit before, isn't it? I think it's about that, like, that almost that term intellectual preparation, isn't it? So there's something already prepared, which is great because, I can remember trying to draw my own part whole models on like Word, and that was not fun.
Yeah.
So, that is amazing that they exist, and like we don't have that trauma anymore during PPA. But actually, we still need to take the time to think, like, what is the thinking that you want to happen? Like, what is it that you want the children to notice at this point, and then how can you help with that? Whether that's through your questions, whether that's through adapting it because you feel like, actually, this isn't quite appropriate for my class. It's so amazing there are these resources, but they'll always need adapting to your class and to your children. The same way, I've never taught the same lesson in different years. It changes every single time. It doesn't matter if I'm in the same year group. You have to change it to the needs of your children that are right there in front of you. And the other thing I think about is, you mentioned it before, you used the word playful, just when you were talking about those experiences. And I think that's really important, like having the opportunity to play with those numbers. So whether that is, you've got your slides there that you're using and things, but thinking about how the children can then explore those. So you might have those strategies, but even if it's like finishing up with a different question and giving children that opportunity to then play with it, because maths should be playful. They should be exploring it. They should be seeing that wonder through it. And different activities will work better in different classes depending on the children that you have with them.
I really like the idea of the intellectual preparation. I just would love to think about, and maybe a little bit more depth about what that actually looks like. For somebody who is, as you said, Kat, sitting in PPA thinking, okay, well, I don't have to create all the models now because some of those are done for me. Although I personally, I do think that there is a power in constructing a model alongside the pupils sometimes, actually, rather than always being on a slide, because sometimes, we want the children to be able to draw these things themselves, don't they? They need to see how they're constructed, I think. And if you've got the opportunity to do that either with a visualizer or on a flip chart, I think that's really powerful. So that's possibly one of the considerations I would make. Okay, as the teacher, I've got this resource. It shows me a great representation that's really going to outline the structure of the maths here so that I can talk to it and make the connections. But rather than showing it on the whiteboard, I'm going to construct it so that the children can see, and then I'm going to be able to give some commentary to that as I'm doing it and explain my thinking and draw attention to what this is actually representing, where the numbers are. I can use maybe some dual coding in terms of colors and things so that I can really bring that to life. So perhaps that's one of the things that I'm going to think about in terms of my intellectual preparation. Are there any other specific things that teachers might consider as part of that process of adapting the lesson from the scheme to actually what they're going to deliver?
I would say thinking about the scaffolds and the representations that you're using or modeling. So you talked there about the visualizer. So if you're using something under the visualizer to really scaffold the thinking or to scaffold I don't know, maybe you are showing, we'll go with column addition because I feel like that we keep coming back to that
Yeah.
one. Maybe if you're showing that with the representations, maybe you're using place value counters or Deans or base 10, and then you're showing that alongside the abstract. Really thinking about at what point will children just be working in the abstract? At what point are you going to recognize that children have got that conceptually and can then perform that in the abstract with, with depth of understanding? So I think you always need a plan for when you're going to fade out that representation or fade out the use of that manipulative, because what we don't want is for them to become a crux or for them just to become another thing that the children are doing. So I'd say that one definitely. And again, if you're using the visualizer and you're modeling something, when are children then going to have the opportunity to do that themselves and internalize it the way that we have as the teacher? So I think definitely that fading of the scaffolding or the manipulative or representation that people are using.
And the appropriate representation, isn't it? Like, I remember going to there was a school not too long ago, and they had a bead string on the slide, and the children were really struggling actually with the bead string. And then the next representation was with the wreck and wreck, and when we were then talking about it afterwards, it turned out that the school didn't have any bead strings. So, like, the children were not familiar with that. It wasn't a representation they were familiar with. They'd never physically held one or been able to see that, see those fives and the tens and those patterns. So actually, that representation, it wasn't drawing attention to the maths in that lesson. It probably was actually increasing like the cognitive load for them. And a lot of children were trying to count how many red beads there were, how many white beads there were. So, like, thinking about having a critical eye against the things that are shown, to be able to see, like, is this right for my children? It might be right for somebody else's, but it might not be right for my children, because actually, if I haven't got that representation and the children can't physically interact with it, then it's probably not right for in my class.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes teachers can feel that they're not allowed to make that sort of decision or change to the scheme, because there's this word that was banded around for a few years about fidelity to a scheme and things. And, that to me, that doesn't mean that you have to just deliver exactly whatever is in the scheme. The fidelity surely should be to the principles of the scheme, and, the idea that, yes, we are teaching in a particular manner, but that doesn't mean that because the scheme uses a bead string, our children are more familiar with the wreck and wreck. Surely you use the wreck and wreck to do the same sort of, representation, really. And feeling empowered to make those decisions is really important, isn't it? And that needs to come from leadership, doesn't it, I think?
Yeah, and I was laughing then because I knew you were going to say fidelity before you
Yeah.
even said it.
Yeah, the F-bomb. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think again it comes back to that shared understanding and that shared language, or that shared recognition in your setting, doesn't it? If you're using a particular scheme or textbook or resource or whatever it may be, it's that understanding of why are you using it, how are you using it, and what does this mean for our school? At school X, this is how we teach maths. And we might use something to help us teach maths, but it's really clear and understood by everybody what that actually means.
Yeah, it's another one of those words again that we mentioned earlier, that how important but also dangerous language can be in education. I think sometimes, fidelity, consistency, what were the other ones that we were talking about earlier? Just mastery, foundation knowledge. Now that they can be put out there, and people are apparently looking for these things, but it can be very easily misconstrued actually what that really means. And I think as a school, you need to have a really clear a really clear definition of what that means for us in our setting, and that everybody then in the school, teachers and support staff and children, are all singing from the same sort of hymn sheet, really, because they've all got a really clear idea that for us, fidelity doesn't mean that we're going to just deliver whatever's in the scheme verbatim, but actually, this is our vision for maths. These are our principles. This is what we're going to use to teach maths, and make sure that it's really effective. So, I think that was a really good point. Well made. Anything else that you wanted to add to the intellectual preparation? Because I felt that was really strong. Just while you're having a think about that, there may not be anything, but I did an episode just a few weeks ago now with Joe Austin, talking about using the right manipulatives and choosing the right manipulatives for the job, in terms of both physical manipulatives but also digital manipulatives as well. So if you want to find out a little bit more about that, it's worth going back and having a listen to that particular episode. But yes, intellectual preparation, very, very important. And I think it's just having those prompts in mind, isn't it, when you're actually planning the lesson. It's to, as you said before, what's the starting point? What's the very nuanced, detailed learning point that I want the children to notice, and how am I going to draw their attention to it, and where do I want them to be by the end of the lesson, and then maybe looking at what's in the scheme and how can I adapt that or make it more accessible, or for those children I think who might need some additional challenge, what question can I ask them at any point in that lesson to really make them think, perhaps.
I think the only other thing that I possibly want to kind of add to is, you talked a little bit about the modelling and the visualizer, etc. And I think sometimes as experienced teachers, we kind of just take for granted how we're going to model or teach something. But maybe it is that careful choice of, how much am I going to talk, or am I going to model this silently, or am I going to model this whilst talking? What will help, what will hinder, what questions will I ask? Am I asking too many questions? And I'm not saying this to, bamboozle teachers or, make them feel anxious about how they teach. It's just maybe having that, I did some work with some maths leaders recently about, things that we do explicitly and things that we do implicitly. And I think the more experienced we become, we do a lot of things, a lot of things are implicit, aren't they? It's just kind of a feeling, it just happens. Yeah. But actually sometimes even, as experienced teachers, we possibly do need to think more explicitly. What question will I ask, and why am I asking this question? Will I model this through a visualizer, and will I talk through each step, or will I do it silently and then ask some key questions afterwards? I think possibly a little bit of that as well through that intelligent preparation.
Yeah, I love that. Again, as experienced teachers, one of the things that you often say is, "Oh yeah, I remember we used to do that." And because there are so many plates spinning all the time, aren't there, that it's inevitable that some things will drop off, and then you remember something that used to be really effective, and you think, yeah, why don't I do that anymore? And it's okay to still do some of those things. So, the silent modelling is a fantastic one. I sometimes started a lesson just by writing numbers on the board and then stepping back and having a think about them, and then maybe doing something with the numbers and seeing who might notice what that was, and then letting them come up and have a go, see if they were on the right track, those sorts of things. Just as ways to engage, children in actually thinking about it, because one of the possible pitfalls, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, but one of the possible pitfalls of having a very, very rigid lesson structure, and I'm not saying that there isn't a place for a lesson structure. I think there is, and I think it's really important that teachers know why they're doing what they're doing when they're doing it, as you sort of alluded to, both of you really. But it can become, okay, I know what's coming next, which can be reassuring, but also I can switch off because I know what's coming next. And I don't really need to think about this because the teacher's going to tell me in a minute what I need to do, and I can just sort of be very passive. So I'm really curious about things that can engage, and when I talk about engage, I mean, I'm not thinking about engagement as a proxy for progress, but engagement as getting children to really think about what's happening, and I think potentially approaches such as the silent modelling are a great way of doing that, because it does, it can make children stop and think for a moment. I'm not sure what my question was at the end of that, I'll be honest, to both of you. But is there a potential problem, do you think, with having an overly strict lesson structure that's always the same?
Yeah, I think a lot of schools, or some schools that I've worked with, definitely they can see the value of a lesson structure.
Yeah.
and they can see the value of even, very clear routines in terms of how children might use a whiteboard, or, you know, even naming those strategies, turn and talk, for example, or
Yeah.
call or response. And all of those things are absolutely great, aren't they, in terms of supporting teachers in having consistency in how a lesson's taught, naming the strategies. We know that if we all call it turn and talk, that, as children move to different teachers, that's great. That's really consistent, so that it kind of reduces some of that cognitive overload. So there's some real values in those things. But then I think, the issue is learning is invisible. So children can look engaged, can't they? They can look
Yeah.
they can look like they're doing all of those strategies. They're responding to when we say, right, we're going to do call or response now, or, they can be writing something on the whiteboard. They can be doing something with manipulatives. But how do we actually know that children have learned something? And I think it links back to a previous point we said about having the confidence to slow down. I'm a real kind of advocate for oracy and discussion, and having a classroom that's steeped in discussion. And I think it's then building in those opportunities to really hear children, isn't it? Hear what they have to say, and not just take one answer and think, yep, all 30 children have heard that, so they understand it in the same way.
Yeah.
It's going back to some of those things that, Dylan William talks about, and, the assessment for learning strategies that we probably do, but again, maybe I've got a little bit lost in the way of it, really, I suppose. Yeah.
Anything you wanted to add to that, Kat?
No, I agree with Kate about the oracy. I think having those opportunities to slow down and to be able to for children to reason, to be able to be explaining, to be able to justify their thoughts and their answers are really important. And that's where you start to see you start to make that learning visible, don't you? Through them being able to show and share that. But that takes time. It does take time, and it needs space within that lesson structure for that to happen, rather than necessarily kind of moving through question after question. But it's also seeing the value in those activities and the learning opportunities that come through that oracy, just as much as through answering, say, a written question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just really important as well, just to look for, we're talking about children who are, in some cases, 4, 5 years old. We should be looking, I think, for things that are going to interest them as well. And yes, I totally agree that the pure joy and wonder of the maths is really important. And maths is the way that we make sense of the world. We can spot patterns all around us and make connections. But just going beyond that, even to just wondering aloud, I wonder what happens when I do this, rather than just saying this is what happens when I do this. Very small tweaks to how we present things, I think, can make a massive difference to how children think about those things. And I know it sounds overly simple, but I think it's quite nuanced and therefore difficult to sort of bottle and distill and just give to new teachers and things. But just reframing how we ask questions, I think, can make a big difference to how children engage with that thinking around those questions. Again, I suppose it goes back a little bit to, am I looking for the answer, or am I looking for something interesting actually that I've noticed about this, rather than just, what the answer is.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about recently is this idea of authentic questions, and how often we ask an authentic question. So an authentic question, in my understanding, is a question that you ask where there's no predetermined answer. You're not looking
Yeah.
for a specific response.
Not guess what's in my head.
Absolutely,
Which is,
yeah. And Kat and I have spoke a lot about how we teach maths, and quite often both of us would start with something to promote discussion. It might be an image, and there's a really well-known textbook scheme that often starts that way.
Yeah.
It might be a mathematical representation, and just for me, I would always say, like, what do you notice? Or if you've got two, what's the same, what's different, and genuinely asking that question without, at that point, somebody might just pick on the colours, or,
Yeah.
it might not be mathematical, but that tells you so much as a teacher. And then, you can then ask further kind of probing, more mathematical questions where you are kind of going to steer them in a direction that you want. And, and I know Kat often would do something similar, wouldn't you, Kat?
Yeah, and I say, what maths questions could you ask?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and yeah, just opens up that discussion, doesn't it? And has got that entry point for you, and then it gives you it's promoting that curiosity. You want them to be wondering about it. You want them to be looking and noticing things and thinking, oh, like you said, I wonder what we can see here, and then you know where you want to take the learning from that. But it's opening it up.
My class were brilliant at making me go off on tangents that could take up the whole of the lesson so that we didn't get anything else done. Not just in maths, but in, all sorts of different subjects, history particularly, I have to say. Yeah, one of the things that made me think about that was there was a particular picture that I used most years, which was of a baseball stadium with a good number of the crowd in there, but not everywhere filled up. And there was so much maths in there in terms of, geometry as well as number, and fractions, percentages and decimals and everything goes along with that, that we could really spend at least an hour really just talking about it, but also then investigating things. And there's a place for that in maths. It's not just a scientific skill, is it, in terms of investigating things, asking questions and trying to find the answers. And it's really difficult sometimes because we know the curriculum is over full, and the coverage is really important, trying to get through things. But I think that message that you keep coming back to, Kate, about slowing down and being brave to slow down will just help children to have an opportunity to think a little bit more about what they're doing rather than just following a procedure. Because even with conceptual understanding, it's really easy to fall into following a procedure with that. This is how you do column addition. We do it because here's the base 10 that we can model it with. If you do this with the base 10, you'll get the answer. And all of a sudden we've fallen back into a procedural way of doing things rather than actually looking for that conceptual understanding. So yeah, slowing down is probably the biggest tip, isn't it? Even though it's a brave thing to do, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
You need the confidence and the space to do it as well, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah. And also the backing as well to do it, don't you? That you're not going to, if you do have a visitor, or whether that's from the LEA or the trust or Ofsted or whoever, that your leadership are going to say, yeah, no, they're doing the right thing here, because for these children, we know that they need to go a little bit slower, and that's going to have the best impact on them. Which also takes a level of subject knowledge and pedagogical knowledge for the leadership of the school as well.
It links back a little bit to what you were saying about the foundational learning, though. If there's a missing block there, or we've gone too quickly with that foundational learning, then it's all going to come crashing down at some point. So actually taking that time to go slow, and that really is what Teaching for Mastery is about, is really securing that good level of understanding, so that then when we move on to something new, we can attach that because we've got the foundations. So I think, yeah, it is about being brave, but also recognising what that actually means in maths. That if we don't have that block there, then yeah, that house is going to come crashing down, isn't it, so to speak?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I realise we could talk about this all day and really get into some detail on lesson design, probably, or task design at least. But I know you're both busy, and I really appreciate the time that you've spent talking to me about this. If people want to find out more about you guys or what Rethink are doing, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what Rethink are doing, actually, because as you say, it's sort of been born into the world about 6-7 months ago, something like that. What is it that's sort of your mission, if you like, at Rethink Math?
Yep. So we have 5 missions. So we've got Rethink Foundations, Rethink Inclusion, Rethink Teaching, Rethink Real World, and Rethink Confidence. And lots of what we've talked about today kind of comes up in all of those missions. I suppose the one to focus in that's probably really useful for people at the moment is foundations. I'm probably going to hand over to Kat because she is the director of foundations, so it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, over to you, Kat.
Yeah, the foundations mission is really exciting. So, we want to make sure that every child has that secure foundations. I think, sometimes we can, through those pressures, through those external pressures, we can be talking about like what level of good development we have, how many children we've got at our early learning goals, how many children at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 1 results as well, and thinking about, kind of national averages and things like that. But yeah, our aim, and it's a big mission, it's a high mission, but our aim is for every child to have those secure foundations. And we've got a really exciting program at the moment. So we've actually got some trials that we're working on. We've got 2 programs as a nursery's foundation program and a program for home reception as well, to help secure children's foundations, and that is being funded by the Richmond project. And we're currently recruiting schools and nurseries at the moment, and that will be starting in September, which we're really looking forward to getting going with that. And
fantastic.
Schools and
So
nurseries.
if people are interested in that, what is it? Rethink Maths, is that the best place to go to find out a little bit more?
Yeah, they can go to the website rethinkmaths.co.uk. They can reach out to Kat and I via LinkedIn. They can find Rethink on all socials as well. So if they just search on Instagram, Facebook, etc., Rethink Maths, they should be able to find it and reach out that way as well.
Wonderful. It sounds like a really exciting project, so best of luck with it. I look forward to seeing the results from it. Thank you once again for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate it. For everybody else, I hope you've taken something from that conversation. If you would like to find out any more or share any of your thoughts with the podcast, you can get in touch with myself, the Primary Maths Podcast at twinkle.co.uk, or get in touch again by pretty much any of the social media platforms. LinkedIn, as Kate mentioned, seems to be the place to be at the moment, though, in terms of those quality conversations happening on LinkedIn on education. Also give the Substack a quick follow as well. There's loads of resources on there and different articles and things. Becky and I will be back on Friday with another Aftermaths episode. But in the meantime, I'll just say thank you once again to Kate and to Kat. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you,
John.
And we will see you next week. Thanks a lot. Take care.